Imagine yourself communicating with a difference. Pandimensional Solutions helps you do this. Whether live spectator events, taped broadcasts, or real-time audience-engaging programs, you can benefit immediately from the tools Pandimensional Solutions will share with you. Do you want to make a difference? Contact us at pandimensional.com. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
How do you like that? I always like when it does that. I press the wrong button and it gives me a floating sort of persona as we enter into yet another week of the State of Greater Western New York Report. This week's going to be a little bit different from the rest, a little bit newer, a little bit of a twist. We're going to be learning about things that you probably haven't talked about since middle school or high school. It's about the geology of the Greater Western New York region, which is fascinating. And I'm actually going to tell you some things they probably didn't tell you about in high school or middle school, maybe because they didn't know, or maybe because, it was just a bit of trivia, and who knows, whatever. But you're going to be totally amazed by what you learn. Now, here's what I'm going to do. For the first half of the show, I'm going to be kind of like in the role of a teacher to kind of bring you up to date on some things that are going on, because in the second half, we're going to have a real live paleontologist talk to us. And so I'm going to prepare you for some of the language that he's going to be using so it doesn't sound too foreign to you. Speaking of foreign, how about this? Do you guys remember these things? They're called trilobites. Trilobites. Yeah, trilobites are some fascinating fossils that are all around here. And you see them like this. I think this is probably what you would see them mostly like. There's two types of fossils here, one indented and one kind of like on the outside. Trilobite, by the way, trilo means three, and lobite, I guess, means lobes. So they stand from three lobes. They're a group of extinct marine arthropods. In fact, they're the earliest known groups of arthropods. They first appeared on the fossil record around 521 million years ago, but they were probably around before then. We just don't have any fossil records. In fact, the reason why we think by the time they were before here, that before we got the fossils, and here's a really good fossil, really intact, is in the first fossils, they were already highly diversified and geographically dispersed. So they were around for a while. And because they had wide diversity and an easily fossilized exoskeleton, they left an extensive fossil record. And in fact, we see a lot of them right here. These fossil records, by the way, really helped people understand things like something called biostratigraphy, paleontology, evolutionary biology. And here's the key thing, because we're going to be seeing this in a moment, plate tectonics. So this is our trilobites. Now, here's the key thing about trilobites. This is the trilobite that is supposedly very rare. It's rare, but we don't know why it's rare, or at least I don't know why it's rare. They called it rare, and I could just say I saw these things when I was growing up. I found them all over the place. I mean, is it any wonder that they're so prevalent in the greater Western New York region? They're all around us. Why? Why are they here? Well, before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about time. Why are we going to talk about time? Because time, it turns out, the terminology of time is very important. And it's something that geologists will use. They have their own time language. And before we get into the geologist time language, we'll talk about the language that you and I use. For example, when we're talking about, say, our lifetimes, or we can talk about it in terms of decades, but that's a little bit too far. What we really do when we talk about something that's long-term, we're talking about it in terms of years, months, and weeks. If we want to break it down smaller, let's just say that it's within a month, then we're going to be talking about weeks, days, or hours. And if it's today that we're talking about, then it's hours, minutes, and seconds. So you can see how things are broken down from bigger to smaller to yet smaller. Geologists use the same sort of criteria when they look at things. They start with these things called eons, immensely large. Actually, there's a super eon. That's way too big to talk about. So there's eons, eras underneath that, and then periods. And it's the periods that we want to be focusing in on. Within the periods, there are epochs and there are ages. In fact, it's a reality that the kinds of periods that we're interested in, or the kinds of times that we're interested right now, are these periods. So, kids, and it's going to really tell you about, well, there we go. I'm back on the screen again. That's always good. I'm going to talk to you about the periods, but I'm really just going to talk to you about a couple of the periods. So let's look and see which ones we're really talking about. It's going to be these two periods right here within the Paleozoic era, the Silurian and the Devonian periods. Those are the ones that are of most interest to us because they have it comes to the rocks that we find here in the greater Western New York region. Now, how did those rocks come about? We're going to start at the very beginning. Well, not quite at the very beginning. That would be the Big Bang Theory, and we don't have enough time to cover that here. But we'll talk about the very beginnings of the planet Earth and how it looked like in terms of what we saw. We're gonna pop this up on the screen, and we're gonna show you what it looked like many, many years ago. So we're gonna go and restart this slide, and we're gonna see what it looked like 750 million years ago. You don't see it here, but glaciers covered the entire planet. It was very cold. Fast forward to 650 million years, and you have, this is years ago, you have that little red dot, by the way. That little red dot is Western New York. Now, if we go back and show you this one before, you'll see that the little red dot is there in the middle, and that's just because it's easier for us to see. But a little bit above that is the equator. So what is that telling you? It's telling you that what is today Western New York was actually behind the equator. So let's fast forward again here, and the little red dot is at the South Pole. So you think things were cold today? You think we're in the snow belt today? Imagine back then, right? Well, wrong. Because even though the Earth was covered by ice 750 million years ago, it was really hot 600 million years ago. So even the South Pole was hot. So things began to develop until we got to a point where about, again, this is 600 million years ago, we see this ocean forming. This is called the Iapetus Ocean. And it keeps on forming larger and larger until these continents come closer together, closer. And they're merging. And what you see here is called the orogeny event. It's an orogeny. It's the Acadia orogeny. And you can see these mountains forming. These mountains are called the Acadia Mountains. They're very, very large mountains, higher than the Himalayas. But notice where the red dot is. The red dot is in this water area. That's not a cloud, that's water. We're underwater. And in fact, this is pretty much going to tell you what it looked like or what we were involved with at that point. It's like our story really starts around 400 million years ago when Western New York really wasn't Western, it was more northern. And by north, I mean as opposed to west. And it was north of the East Coast. So you can see the East Coast is below us. It appears a little bit west here because we're going further in time. But we're hanging still about 42 degrees south latitude, not north latitude. You can see that the equator is still hugging right above the top, right above us. So we're much closer to the we get closer to the equator as time goes by. In fact, we evolved so that we're just south of the equator. And what's happening is that there we go. We're going to see what happens over time as these things come together. Here we go. Let's restart. Let's go forward again. And you can see these things coming together. There we go. The continents are coming together to form these mountains. And we were totally underwater, but it was shallow water at least. Now you notice that the land is coming forward, this inland sea in the pre-Pangerian continent called Laurentia, which is a precursor of North America. This sea stretched all the way to the Hudson Valley, but eventually filled in. In fact, that period of time, this is the Devonian period during the Paleozoic era, is called the Age of the Fishes. There's Pangea for you to see. But about 10 or 20 million years after this, Laurentia collided first with Avalonia and then with Baltica, and then you don't have to remember any of these names, but it closed that ocean. So we saw the ocean disappear, the Iapetus Ocean, and those mountains, those Acadian mountains that you saw there, they eroded. You know, if you're a student of geology, then you know why there's one underlying trait of most of these early mountain ranges, and that is you can't see them anymore. Why not? Because nature, in her infinite wisdom, saw to these earthen behemoths that they would be eroded into oblivion. But that's not to say they haven't left their DNA strewn across the countryside. In fact, much of the study of Devonian geology takes place right here in the greater Western New York region. That's what we look like today, by the way. This is where the Acadia Mountains left their fingerprint in the form of the rocks beneath our feet and jutting through the various rock cities among us. In the case of the Acadians, water erosion from the west side of these mountains brought down silt and small pebbles into the gigantic delta known as the Catskill Delta. Yeah, that's right. It's around the Catskill Mountains, right around that area. This is no ordinary delta formed by a single river, like, for example, the Mississippi Delta, but it's a huge complex of deltas formed by many rivers. The Acadian Mountains, I should say, spent the remainder of the Devonian period bleeding themselves into this delta. And as a result, the shoreline moved from the Hudson Valley to western New York over time. And as the sediment was deposited, the layers above crushed the layers below into various rock forms. And in fact, according to one nature blog, western New York harbors one of the most extensive outcrops of Devonian rocks in North America. It's a tribute to the significance of western New York geography that many types of rock from the Devonian period are named for western New York locales, where they were first discovered. Unfortunately, the period itself was named in the region England, where the rocks were very first identified. But just to give you an example, you remember the famous or the infamous Rochester shale that so easily crumbled under the dry Niagara Falls? That represents a form of shale that was first discovered in the vicinity of Rochester. The downside of all this geology is the lack of biology. The less disturbed shallow sea in Pennsylvania, because remember, that was farther away from us, so it didn't get covered up first. So that was the graveyard of exotic ferns and other plant life. While in western New York, we became more of a cemetery for marine life. Trilobites. Remember, they were marine arthropods. So the downside really is this. Pennsylvania, where all the plants were, they got most of the oil. New York got some of it, but it mostly got natural gas. So we got layers of limestone where they got barrels of oil. Now the limestone wasn't bad because what the limestone was used for was for the production of steel. And that ended up being a very, very important aspect of the greater Western New York region. So that's a very brief history of what happened, geologically speaking, within the greater Western New York region. So we're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we're going to be interviewing a paleontologist about the amazing truth of the Western New York geology.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. "50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York." Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Hi, Chris Carosa back again. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about this particular facet of Greater Western New York, that book has a chapter devoted to it in a lot more detail than what I just went over in the previous 15 minutes. And when I say a lot more detail, I'm not talking like a textbook. I'm saying in a way that is generally much more consumable for the average mind, like ours. So, who do I have with me today to talk to? I have a guy who's really been into this stuff. His name is George McIntosh, and he's emeritus paleontologist from the Rochester Museum and Science Center. And he's going to tell us a little bit more in detail about what we just learned. And I think you're going to find not only will it be interesting, but there's going to be a fact that he reveals that I bet you never knew. So, George, let's start off with this. How the heck did we get below the equator?
It's interesting that this whole region, if you go back starting about 600 million years ago or so, was all basically covered at various times with tropical seas. Rochester, when we look at the rocks down near Mendon, that would have been about 400 million years ago, would have been about 30 to 35 degrees south of the equator. And if we were looking off to what is presently the east, we would have seen the beginnings of a very large mountain chain. That mountain chain was caused by the collision of some microcontinents into what is now the east coast of North America. Of course, all this is differed over time because gradually what is presently east was to our south back in the Devonian.
Interesting. So why is the Devonian period important to the geology of the Western New York region? I mean, what makes it stand out, and why is there so much interest, not only here locally, but around the rest of the world?
The Devonian period itself is what I work on. That's my special interest. And I've been working on that for over 50 years. Basically, a couple of things that are important that occurred during the Devonian. The first thing is that plants started to conquer the land. And so basically at the very beginning of the Devonian, you would have had a terrestrial flora that composed of forests that were about 4 or 5 inches tall. But by the middle Devonian, which is about 385 million years ago, you've already got essentially forests and trees that have formed. The other thing that goes with that hand in hand is the colonization of earliest insects. Arthropods are a bit older than this, but everything is starting to come on land. And most importantly to us, I suppose, is that we are actually getting vertebrates coming onto land. So by the end of the Devonian, you actually have the earliest amphibians known anywhere in the world. And some of those are found right here in, not necessarily in Western New York as much as Western Pennsylvania, but still it's all part of the same complex.
Very, very interesting there. There's a lot of interesting facts that people could learn about the Devonian period. One of them is this one here. If you were to say, now I know what the answer is because I peeked. That's what happens when you're the host of the show. You get to know things in advance. But George, what's the one thing you think is most interesting that people, or another thing that might be more interesting to people about the Devonian period?
Another interesting thing about the Devonian is that the day was only about 20 hours long. So we had about 400 days in a Devonian year. And we've been able to tell that by looking at growth bands in corals and things like that. So basically, the Earth has been slowing down since then. Of course, we have 365 days today, but back then, 400 days.
So there's a lot of things about the Devonian period that are pretty interesting, and we have a lot of rocks here within the Devonian period that we see. But here's the question that I want to know: how come England got its name? How come the thing got named after England? I mean, why are there rocks over there? It's all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. It's kind of interesting, but I'd like to hear an explanation.
There's a lot of interesting things to say about the Devonian as far as why did this mountain chain form? But basically, to boil it all down, is that we had an ocean which was called the Iapetus, and the Iapetus Ocean formed about 600 million years ago, and it gradually expanded up until about 430 million years ago before it started contracting again. And during the Silurian, we had something called the Caledonian orogeny. And the Caledonian orogeny actually formed up in the northern Scandinavia and northern maritime provinces. But by the Devonian, we had something called the Acadian orogeny. And this was the final closing of that ocean, that Iapetus Ocean. And by this time, all the countries that we think of as the United Kingdom, Norway, Scandinavian countries, Germany, Russia, Western Russia, all these things have collided with North America. So so the Devonian is a very interesting time, and we're very fortunate to have these rocks in the fossil record here in Western New York.
Yes, we are, and in fact, now it comes down to the question of the day, and that is the trilobites. Why are they so easily found throughout Western New York?
Again, when it comes to the fossil record in Western New York, we're almost totally marine fossils here. We do have a little bit of terrestrial deposits coming in off the Catskill Delta, and that delta is formed from this large mountain chain formed by the collision of all these little microcontinents with North America. So if you were to look around, everything we see is all shallow water, marine, tropical sea faunas.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I remember when I was a kid, I would always find these trilobites. They were amazing. Everywhere you'd look, you'd see scrap limestone, and they would use it for fill or something, and there would be fossils in there. And you could go to different. Penn-Dixie outside of Hamburg, New York, is a famous place you can go to find these sort of fossils and see what's down there. But in Penn-Dixie, it was a quarry, so the limestone was revealed. How far do you really have to dig down in order to find these fossils?
Well, that's an interesting point, because an awful lot of this is later covered by sediments dropped by the glaciers, the giant continental glaciers that came in here starting about 2 million years ago or so. But there are some good exposures. People from all over the world. I mean, when I say all over the world, I mean China and Australia and Europe. And certainly people from North America come to Western New York to study our fossils and our rocks. There's good exposures, obviously, down at Letchworth. And there's good exposures in a variety of different places.
Thank you, George. That's very fascinating. And in fact, you can go down wherever you want to, whether it's Letchworth or anywhere else, to see these sort of things. And again, I would say go to Penn-Dixie in Hamburg. That's probably the easiest point to access. That's a tourist attraction. I remember scouts going there and looking for fossils. So if you're really interested in fossils, that's a great place to go there, which makes me think maybe we should have had somebody from Penn-Dixie on the show. We can do that again later. I mean, like I said, this subject is very fascinating. So, George, I want to thank you very much for participating in today's show. And I wanted to thank all of you for listening in to today's State of Greater Western New York report. And I want to remind you, we are live via Zoom at noon every Thursday. That's live on Zoom every Thursday at noon. And if you want to get the invite, then you have to go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and register there so that you will get the invite of when the show is going to be airing next. You'll get the special Zoom instructions to go there. If you can't see the show live, by the way, if you do see the show live, you can interact with us, and if you chat, I'll read it and I'll ask the guest our question. You can see in past shows how we've done that, especially with the legislators. People really have an interest in asking their elected officials questions, and this is certainly an easy way to do that. But you have to do it during the live version. You can't do it in the recorded or the tape versions. These shows are archived on stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com, so you can go ahead and look at those. And in fact, what I should do is at some point, but maybe not today, is I will put up the little bug over there so that you can tell where the show is located, because you stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. There's actually 2 dots in there. It's state of, altogether one word, dot, Greater Western New York, all one word, .com. So that's how you go to that website. And again, you register there and you will be invited to the live Zoom shows. You'll get the credentials to do that. If you can't do that, just go to the website. You can see the archive. Or if you want to see it broadcast on the social media platforms, it is broadcast at 1:30 p.m. every Sunday following the show. So you can get that on YouTube or Facebook. Just go to the Facebook page, greaterwesternnewyork.com. If you want to be notified, follow that. If you want to go to YouTube, just like us when you see us on YouTube so that we can get enough likes so that the channel will be easier to find. But again, you just search Greater Western New York and you'll be able to see us on YouTube. So with that, I'm pretty sure that's all we have for today. Is that all we have for today? I don't know, because I'm not the only one talking here. Well, I think that I am. So again, this is Chris Carosa signing off for the State of Greater Western New York Report. See you next week.
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Bend and Honeylight Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history.